Let's open our Bibles to the 19th chapter of the Gospel according to Luke. We're going to be in Luke chapter 19 this morning. If you'd like to encourage everyone to follow along with us as we go through the Bible verse by verse. And as you're turning to Luke 19, I ask a question. Have you ever been going along in life and you kind of realized that you were going the wrong way? You know, that you were doing things wrong and you had to make some sort of adjustment. You had to change the direction that you were going. That's true when we're driving, but it's also true in the direction of life that we might be heading in, choices that we make along the way. For example, there was this lifelong city boy who had lived in the big city all of his life and had the commuting and the job and the pressure, and he got tired of the rat race. And so he decided that he was going to just give that all up, and he was going to move out into the country and become a chicken farmer. And so he bought this nice little quaint chicken farm out in the middle of the country, and he moved in. And as it turned out, his next door neighbor was also a chicken farmer. So he went over, neighbor came over to introduce himself, and he told him, he said, chicken farming isn't easy. It can be kind of tough. And so just, I'd like to kind of help you get started. And so just, I'm going to give you 100 of my chickens, and you can kind of use those as the beginning of your industry. And so he was very thrilled by that and just loved the neighborly way that things were in the country. And he took the chickens, and a couple of weeks went by, and he was talking to his neighbor again, and the neighbor asked him, says, "How's the chicken farming going?" And the guy said, "Well, not real well." And he said, "Why? What's the matter?" And he goes, "Well, I hate to tell you, but all 100 of your chickens died." And the guy said, "What? I can't believe that." Well, okay, let me give you another 100 chickens, and you can kind of, maybe things go different with that. And so he did, and another couple of weeks go by, and they just happened to meet down at the feed store. And so the neighbor asked him, says, "So how's the chicken farming going?" And he goes, "You're not going to believe this, but all of the second 100 chickens you gave me, they all died." And the neighbor said, "I've never heard of anything like that. What do you think's going on?" He goes, "I don't know if I'm planting them too deep or too far apart." So if you find out you're going the wrong direction, it's you're making wrong choices. The good thing is to turn around, and sometimes that happens in life when the bottom falls out. We come up to some sort of crisis, and we are just, oh no, what am I going to do? And so we just realize that we have to make changes. But sometimes that realization is a little more subtle, a little more internal. You just become aware that there's something that's not quite right on the inside. Such is the case of this guy that we all know as Zacchaeus in Luke chapter 9. And it says, "And Jesus entered and passed through Jericho." Remember we saw last week that there was two Jerichos. There's the old Jericho, which was kind of like the other side of the tracks. That's kind of where the lower income was. And then they had built a new Jericho just a few hundred yards away. And this was the burbs. I mean, this was the bedroom community for Jerusalem. These were the guys that they would people use that as kind of a winter getaway. That's where the snowbirds of the first century went. It was the Phoenix or the Miami of the time of Jesus. And as he's going through that section, he said there was a man named Zacchaeus who was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. We probably know the story of Zacchaeus from Sunday school, and we all know the little ditty that goes along with him about him being a wee little man. But it's interesting that his name, Zacchaeus, means pure one. Which if you understand what it was to be a tax collector in that day, you wouldn't necessarily ascribe that name to a tax collector. They were the most despised of the whole Jewish people. But it says that he was a chief tax collector. Now, the word tax collector is from the Greek word telones. And the reason why I explain this is that it's kind of one of those swished up Greek words where it's made up of two parts that they put together. The first part of it, telos, means to end or to become perfected or to be continual or eternal, something that just goes on and on and on and on. And then the second part of it is from the word oneomai, which means to buy. So you can kind of understand where that would be ascribed to a tax collector, because they're always buying your money, as they would collect the taxes. There was never ever any end to it, and that's kind of the way that they viewed the tax collectors in that day. And they would be Jewish people who had lobbied the Roman government for the right to excise the taxes from the other Jewish people, and then anything that they could scrape off the top, anything that they could force out of the people, they got to keep. And so it was a very lucrative position, but it was also a very despised position. They were the outcasts of the Roman society, or the Jewish society. They were considered to be sellouts. Zacchaeus was not only a tax collector, he was the chief tax collector. Architelones. That was the grand poobah of tax collecting. I mean, we can only imagine how despised he would have been. Him being he would have had this whole pyramid Ponzi thing going on with him being at the top, where all the other, not only was he collecting taxes, but all the other tax collectors were paying him money for the right to work under him. And he was in this city named Jericho. And it says in verse 3 that he sought to see who Jesus was, but could not because of the crowd, for he was of short stature. So, he had this kind of like this full-on Danny DeVito thing going on. I mean, he was a guy of very, very short stature. And those of you who don't know, ask the person next to you. They will tell you who Danny DeVito is. But he was a wee little man, the Bible tells us. And he had come to the place in his life of riches and opulence and having the best that money can buy. He had come to the place in his life where he realized that riches aren't everything. They can't fill the God-shaped hole that is created within each and every one of us. They just can't do that. So John Calvin, I think, I love his comment about, he says, curiosity and simplicity are a sort of preparation for faith. And this was Zacchaeus. He'd heard about Jesus. He'd heard about that he was a way maker, that he was a promise keeper, that he was a miracle worker. And so he had come to kind of check it out. His curiosity had been piqued, and he was wondering if there's any possibility that this guy that he's been hearing about could be the answer to this emptiness that was inside of him. He had curiosity, just as John Calvin's talking about. He wondered what was going on with this fame of the man Jesus. And he had this simplicity in the fact that he didn't come with some sort of a settled mind, some sort of preconceived idea of who Jesus was going to be. He was just going to find out. And he was ready to receive whatever the answer was going to be. He wasn't going to put Jesus into his own mold. He wanted to see who Jesus was for who he was. And so he ran ahead and he climbed up in a sycamore tree to see him, for he was going to pass that way. Could you imagine this? I mean, this is a guy, he's probably wearing a very expensive Armani toga. He's got these Italian sandals, and he's looking pretty fine. And here he is in the midst of all the people, and he's crawling up and climbing into a tree. That's something you wouldn't. A grown man in that culture wouldn't go climb a tree, even in their own backyard where nobody could see him. That's what kids do. And yet he's going to do this right in the middle of this entire crowd, this throng of people that has come to see Jesus, and he wants to be able, nobody's going to put him on his shoulders, so he's going to climb up where he can see Jesus. So he climbs up into a sycamore tree. And this is not your usual actions for a government official, okay? That's not the way they would normally act. But for those of you that were here when we were in chapter 18, In verse 17, Jesus said, "Surely I say to you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will by no means enter it." And here we have Zacchaeus as a visual illustration of what Jesus was talking about. He's acting just like a child. The kids climb trees. And what Zacchaeus is saying, I ain't care about protocol. I'm not concerned with how this is going to look. I don't have any concern with what people are going to think about what I'm doing right now. I want to see Jesus. And so, throwing all of that aside, he climbs up into the tree because he knew this was the path that Jesus was going to be going down. The prayer that Zacchaeus was praying, and it might sound a little weird to hear it this way if you've been a Christian for any length of time, but I know many people who have prayed this prayer, and the Lord has honored it. What he was praying is, Lord, whoever you are, I don't know who you are. God, if I am willing to worship you, whoever you are, however you reveal yourself to me. I don't want to have preconceptions. I don't want to tell you who you are. I don't want to have a concept of you. Whoever you are, reveal yourself to me, and I will worship you. Now, that's a pretty open-ended prayer, but that's effectively what Zacchaeus is saying. And I know many people who have made that prayer, and they never did think that God was going to reveal himself as a fundamental Christian, like anything but that. But they were open. They had this curiosity and this simplicity that they were willing to receive God, whoever it was. There are, I think, a lot of reasons why people stay in their sins, why they don't come to the Lord. One is they're not willing to give up their pride. Ain't no way they're going to climb a tree in front of everybody and just have everybody look at him and say, boy, can you see that guy over there? And they're not willing to do that, and so they just kind of stay in their sins because they don't want to give up their pride. They're more concerned about how it might look. And here's Zacchaeus saying, I'm throwing all that aside. I'm just going to go see Jesus. And when Jesus came to the place, verse 5, he looked up and saw him, and he said to him, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must stay at your house. So he looks up and he says, Zacchaeus, come on down here. I'm going to stay at your house today. And so here's Zacchaeus' response. He says in verse 6, he made haste, came down, and received him joyfully. So this is Zacchaeus. Jesus came, I'm going to receive you. And so Zacchaeus said, well, I want to receive you. And so he came down, received him joyfully. And when they saw it, they all complained, said, he has gone to be a guest of a man who is a sinner. The word guest here is kind of interesting. It's the word kataluo. I know I'm throwing a lot of Greek words at you this morning, but I think this is kind of significant. Kata sometimes it's a preposition that means against or it's kind of oftentimes used in a negative sense. And then the word luo means to loose. Our word loose comes from it. And what the kataluo, when you put the two together, it means to destroy, to dissolve. Think of an atom being released. You would use the word katalua to describe it. It means to destroy, to dissolve, or to disunite. And you think, that's the word for guest? It's the same word that Jesus uses in Matthew 24:2, where Jesus said to the crowd, he says, do you see all these things? Or said to his disciples, assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. And the word be thrown down is the word kataluo. There's not one stone on this temple that's still going to be left on top of the other one. They're all going to be disunited. They're all going to be discombobulated. And that's the word for guest. You probably have too. I've had guests like that, you probably have as well. But what it means is, the reason why it's translated by that, it means you've come on a long journey. You got this pack, you got this burden, your suitcases, you're carrying along your luggage, and I want to destroy the burden of your journey. So let me disunite you from the burden of that. And that's how it's translated as guest. I want to take this burden away from you so that you can refresh yourself and that you can enjoy your time in my home. Take your pack off and spend the night. That's the idea behind this. And Jesus tells Zacchaeus, I'm going to be your guest. I'm going to your house and I'm going to take my pack off. Zacchaeus had no idea that what was going to happen is Jesus was going to come to his house and Zacchaeus was going to take his pack off. He was going to get rid of his baggage. But Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor. And if I have taken anything from anyone by false accusation, I restore fourfold. Where it says if here, where it says if I've taken anything by default or by ripping somebody off, it's not the idea of, like, it's not the subjective idea about if you say if. If I did, I do, I'll get it, but if I didn't, not going to do it. That's not the idea here. It's insofar as I have. Think of it when he says, if I've treated anybody unfairly and deceitfully, and then I'm going to pay it back fourfold. In Philippians 4:8, Paul has the same sort of idea when he talks about the very well-known passage about where he talks about whatever things are true or noble or just, whatever things are pure and lovely and of good report. And then he says, if there is any virtue and if there is anything praiseworthy, think on that. Insomuch as these things are noteworthy and praiseworthy, think on these things. And this is what Zacchaeus is saying about the way he has treated people as the chief tax collector. Not only did he rip off the people, but he ripped off the tax collectors that were under him. Homeboy has ripped off a lot of people. And he says, insofar as I have done that, I'm going to pay him back fourfold. Now, in the law, the penalty for extortion was 20%. Leviticus 5:16 says, and he shall, talking about if somebody rips somebody off, extorts from somebody, says he shall make restitution for the harm that he has done in regard to the holy thing, and shall add 1/5 or 20% to it and give it to the priest. That's the law. The law said if you ripped somebody off, you had to pay them back 20%. So if you ripped off somebody for $100, you had to pay them $100 plus 20% extortion fee. You had to pay them back what you took from them plus 20%. That's the law. Zacchaeus says, I'm going to pay everybody back. If I rip somebody off for $400, insofar as I rip somebody off for $100, I'm going to give them back $400. Zacchaeus took the standards of grace. And so, here's Jesus just saying, Zacchaeus, come down from that tree, go to your house because I'm coming to be your guest today. I'm just going to come. You don't have to do anything. Just receive me. Just open your arms. I'm coming. And if you welcome me into your house, I'm going to be your guest. And Zacchaeus saw that as the Lord extended him this grace, he saw the standards of grace as being infinitely more than the standards of the law. Not saying that we're under a greater burden than under the law. He just saw that the standard of grace was greater than the standard of the law. For those of you that were asleep, he saw the standards of grace greater than the standards of the law. And so Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house because he also is a son of Abraham. But the Son of Man has come to seek and save that which was lost. Now, again, if you were here in chapter 18, we looked at the story that we know as the rich young ruler. There was this cat that he was rich and he was young and he was in power. He had authority. And he came to Jesus and said, Lord, what must I do to be saved? And Jesus said, liquidate. Sell all things you got and then give the money to the poor and then come and follow me. Notice Jesus, here's this guy, this Zacchaeus, who's probably as rich or richer than the young ruler dude we looked at in chapter 18, and he doesn't tell him to do that. He doesn't tell him to sell all that he has and give it to the poor. He did what here's the rich young ruler and Zacchaeus. They both are recognizing that something just isn't right in their life. There's something that's missing. And they both recognize that Jesus was the answer to that. I've got this hole in my life, and it's not being fulfilled by any of the things that I do. And they recognize that Jesus was the one who could fill the hole. They both did that. Rich young ruler and Zacchaeus were both on the same page there. But where they differed was, knowing that Jesus was the answer, the rich young ruler was not willing to give it all up. He didn't want to give up the stuff that he had. And Zacchaeus is making it very, very clear that he's willing to. All of his stuff no longer means anything to him because his life was now going to belong to Jesus. That's the difference between the two of them. The rich young ruler wasn't willing to give it all up. Zacchaeus was. Now, this was a very scandalous thing what Jesus was doing. Going to the house of a going to the house of a tax collector was one thing, but going to the house of a chief tax collector, that's off the charts. You can imagine how scandalous this was among the people. I mean, this is not only a thing that would make the Pharisees cluck their tongues, this would make the common person cluck their tongue. Because the tax collectors are always gouging him. And here Jesus is treating him like he was okay. He's a sinner. And they're all saying he's going to eat with a sinner. He's going to be the guest of a sinner. That was a very scandalous thing what Jesus was doing. You know, I pray that Calvary Chapel of Oklahoma City, that our church that we hold so dearly, I pray that it will always be a place where sinners feel welcome. I pray that nobody ever comes through the door and they feel like somebody turns around and looks at them and judges them and feels like they are unworthy, that they are unwelcome, that they shouldn't be here. I pray that if that ever happens, it'll be exposed. I think we should always be very welcoming and open to sinners. Because we want sinners to know Jesus. We want to bring them to Jesus. And Jesus will accept them. Greg Laurie always says Jesus likes to catch his fish first and then he cleans them. Jesus wants to accept people just the way they are. And then he begins the process of taking them to where he wants them to be. And I pray that, we will always be a catalyst for people in that process. You know, that the Lord would always use us to bring people into our midst so that they can find Jesus, so that he can begin the process of changing their lives. This is what's going on in our story. And I pray that we would be just as scandalous in this manner as what Jesus is being here. Well, as they heard these things, he spoke another parable because he was near Jerusalem and because they thought the kingdom of God would appear immediately. So therefore he said, so he comes out of, he goes to Zacchaeus' house, has lunch, spends some time. Then Jesus and his entourage, they get up, and it's only a short way from Jericho to Jerusalem. It's a very steep incline. It's like climbing a hill, climbing a mountain. But as he begins his way toward Jerusalem, and he's got his disciples and all the people that have gathered to follow him on his way into Jerusalem. There's a large crowd with him. And it says that he tells them this story. And so he said, verse 12, a certain nobleman went into a far country to receive a kingdom, for himself a kingdom, and to return. And so he called 10 of his servants and delivered to them 10 minas and said to them, do business until I come. My New King James gives the phrase, do business until I come. Now, if you got the Old King James, the word minas that's just transliterated from the Greek word. You may have the word pounds if you have the Old King James, which is a decent translation because a British pound is a British weight of sterling silver. That's why it's called pound sterling. And it's actually a weight of money that is represented by the British pound. And the same thing a mina was, same concept. It was a weight of money. And there's another story that Jesus is going to tell in a few days. He's on his way to Jerusalem now, and once he gets to Jerusalem, he gives the famous, what we know as the Olivet Discourse. He's going to give this other story that is called the parable of the talents. And they're oftentimes confused because they do have some similarities. And it even leads some people to errantly, but it leads some people to the conclusion that they're both the same story. And so I want to real quickly kind of go through a look of the two of them so that we can see where they jive and where they're not the same. Two different time periods, two different locations, two different stories. The parable of the talents we find in Matthew 25 in verses 14 to 31, whereas our text in Luke 19, 11 to 27 is where we find the parable of the minas. In Matthew's gospel, one talent, that's also a weight of money. And it was worth 6,000 denarii. Denarius was a day laborer's wages. If you went out and worked for a guy in a field for a day, then your payment for that day would be one denarius. It's basically minimum wage. Okay, it was the minimum wage in that day was one denarius. A talent is worth 6,000 of those, whereas a mina is 1/60th of a talent is worth 100 denarii. In Jesus' story in Matthew, there's 3 different servants, and as we're going to see in our story, there's 10 servants that this guy has. And in Matthew's account of the parable of the talents, when the rich guy, the boss guy, comes back, he calls his servants to himself, and he talks with 3 of the servants that he has, and one of them said that your talent that you gave me is now worth 5 talents. Another one said your talent you gave me is worth 2. Another one said the talent you gave me is still just worth 1. Whereas in the parable of the minas, in the parable of the talents, he gave them differing amounts, 5 to one, 2 to another, and 1 to another. In the parable of the minas, he gave 10 servants, all 1 mina each. Okay, and in the parable of the talents, the guy that was given 5 did 100% increase. He said, I made 5 more. The one that had given 2, he says, you gave me 2 talents, and I've earned 2 more. And the one that had only given 1 talent, he said, here's your talent back. I kept it safe and sound. In the parable of the minas, they'd all had the same amount of money, and one brought back, he said, your 1 talent has earned 10 talents. That's 1,000% increase, I think. Isn't that right? You meant okay. Math guys, that's 1,000% increase. The other one said your 1 mina has earned 5 minas, and that's 500% increase. And the other one, we're going to find out, stuck it in a sock and hit it in the hole in the backyard. And he said, here's your mina back. Now, the talent, it's the Greek word talentos, and it originally meant it was a weight of money. It was 6,000 denarii. Over the years, through the etymology from 1st century Greek to 21st century English, it kind of went through a morphing, and it went from being a possession that you own, like a weight, to a talent that you had. And it's our English word talent actually is a derivative of this, just going a long way through word etymology. The word mina still means mina, because we don't use that word anymore. But these are 2 entirely different stories. The parable of the talents is talking about, we don't all have the same amount of talentos. Some of you guys are more talented than me. God has given you more gifting, if you will, than he has maybe me. And in some cases, maybe I've got a little bit more than somebody else. He doesn't give the same amount to all of us. But when we are called into account, when we are called before him at the Bema, we will give an explanation of what we did with the talents that he entrusted to us, the gifts, if you will, that he graced us with. And it's an accounting of the faithfulness that he enables us to be able to serve him with. He gives us these gifts, and how well do we do with them? Whereas the parable of the minas, we're all given the same thing. And this is a parable that has to do with the faithfulness that we have to the Lord. We have all been given, as Paul says, a measure of faith. That's all been given to us. We all have the 1 mina. And what do we do with that measure of faith? How faithful are we to what God has entrusted to us in our lives, as our lives? And that's the difference. The talents are talking about the gifts, and the minas are talking about the opportunities. that he gives us. We all have the same opportunity to pray. We all have the same opportunity to share our faith. We all have the same opportunity to grow closer to the Lord and to learn His Word and so forth. And so that's the difference between these two uh, stories. In Matthew 25, it says that He gave to each one, as He gave these varying amounts of talents, He gave to each one according to his ability. And in this one, He says, in the parable of the minas, He says, "Do business until I come." Pragmatuomai. Our word pragmatics comes from that. And that means, it comes from the root of the word means to do, to work. Um, the word pragmatic means if you do something that works, then it's good. It's kind of taken on sort of a moral stance in today's culture. But the Old King James, where Jesus says, "Do business until I come," in the Old King James, it says, "Occupy till I come," doesn't it? You Old King James guys. "Occupy until I come," Jesus says. And I like that. I mean, that's just kind of, it's doing business, but you kind of see it means it like taking care of your space, taking care of what God has entrusted to you, being faithful to what He's entrusted in our lives. Occupy. Do business. NLT says, "Invest for me while I'm gone." That's what He says to the servants. And as we look at the parable, the teaching that Jesus has given us here, He's all given us a mina. He's all given us the same measure of faith. And He says, now, take care of stuff. Invest that. Occupy until I come. But it says His servants hated Him. This guy, he went off to a far kingdom to receive the kingdom himself, and they sent a delegation after him saying, "We will not have this man reign over us." Interestingly enough, this is actually based on loosely upon a true story. After the death of Herod the Great in around 4 BC, his son Archelaus wanted to ascend to the throne. And he actually did. He put on these white robes and everything and actually ascended, walked up to the throne of Herod and sat on it as though he was going to be king. And the thing was that the citizens, the people, where Herod ruled over all of Israel, not only Judea, but he was Caesar trusted him so much he gave him the entire land of Israel to rule over and let him use the title of king. Well, when Archelaus ascended to the throne, the people thought, this guy is a terrible leader. He's a terrible king. And so they sent a delegation of 50 people to Rome to appeal to Caesar and says, don't let him be king. And so what he did, because there was such an uproar over his ascending to the throne, that Caesar told Archelaus, you can't be called king. You can't rule over all Israel. In fact, what I'm going to do is take all of Israel and I'm going to divide it into parts between you and your other relatives. And you can have the title of ethnarch, which means you're just over your clan. You're over your group of ethnicity. Our word ethnicity comes from it. And then later it was changed to tetrarch because the way they had it divided up. And so it was that when he returned, having received the kingdom, that he commanded these servants to whom he had given the money to be called to him, that he might know just how much every man had gained by trading. If you remember back in chapter 16, when we looked at the judgment seat of Christ, as it's usually translated, the Bema seat, the Bema of Jesus Christ. All believers will appear before that. We looked at that back in chapter 16, and that's where Christians stand before the Lord when we enter into eternity. I think it's right at the rapture when he calls all of his people, all of his children together, and we stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And this is where his people, the redeemed people, will be judged for what they did down here on earth. Now, it's not a judgment of sins because our sins were paid for at Calvary. It's going to be more of a judgment of whether we get rewards for the things we did or we suffer loss, as Paul said to the 1 Corinthians. Remember, you can go back and check out the teaching in chapter 16 if you're unfamiliar with this. That's kind of what he's talking about here in the parable. This is where he calls his people, and then he says he wants them to give an account of how they had occupied until he came. Okay? And so then came the first, saying, Master, your mina has earned 10 minas. And so he said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. We use that phrase a lot. This is where it comes from. He says, well done, good servant, because you've been faithful in very little, have authority over 10 cities. You did one, changed it into 10, so I'm going to give you um, rulership over 10 cities. You can be the mayor over 10 cities. And then he says, um, the second one in verse 18 says, Master, your mina has earned 5 minas. And so likewise he said to him, okay, well, then you can have authority over 5 cities. And then another one came and he says, Master, here's your mina, which I've kept away in a handkerchief. I put it in my sock and buried it in the hole out in the backyard because, he says, verse 21, I feared you because you're an austere man, and you collect where you did not deposit, and you reap where you did not sow. Now, this is one of the problems that we can have with Jesus' parables. If he doesn't tell us what we can understand there's kind of an overarching lesson here, and that's the lesson that we should take from it. But if we start ascribing details to, okay, well, the ruler here obviously is God, and the servants are us, and so we start doing it. But then if we press it too far, we find out that God is this austere man. And the word is austeros. We just transliterate it straight over in our English, which means harsh or severe. And that's not God. That's not Jesus' point. He's not trying to teach us about the nature of God here. He's trying to teach us how we should be faithful with the things that he entrusts to us. That's the lesson, not the nature of God. And he said to him, out of your own mouth I will judge you. This is verse 22. You wicked servant. You knew that I was an austere man, collecting where I didn't deposit and reaping where I didn't sow. So why then did you not put my money in the bank, that at my coming I might have collected it with interest? You could have put it in the bank and it could have drawn 0.5%, which is about what you get from a savings account today. By the way, something I think we can take away from this is that you have people today say that Christians should never borrow money. And I understand that there is wise borrowing and unwise borrowing. Credit card usage is a good example of unwise borrowing. But the way that banks operate is the reason why when I put my money in the bank, I can draw 0.5% interest is because they make money loaning you guys money for a car loan. And you pay back 5% on your car loan, and then my savings account draws 0.5% in interest, and then they have all their operations and everything else, and that's how banks make money. What Jesus is doing in this story is kind of legitimizing that. If you take away the borrowing money, then you take away the drawing of interest on your accounts. And Jesus said, you should have put it in the bank so I could have drawn some interest. Banking is a legitimate endeavor, along with the saving and the borrowing. But he said to those who stood by, so still going on with the parable, and this rich guy, the authority guy, the guy that would be king, says, take the mina from him and give it to him who has 10 minas. But they said to him, Master, he's already got 10. For I say to you that everyone who has will be given, and from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. In other words, Jesus is not saying that Jesus is going to come and take away all our stuff, but he will take away what he's entrusted to us to serve him. That we can't take that to heaven, and so the only thing we can take to heaven are the rewards that we have for our service for him on earth. And we'll either receive rewards or we will have a lack of rewards. That's what the parable or the teaching of the judgment seat of Christ teaches us. Two reasons why I think we could say that this guy didn't occupy, that he didn't do business, that he didn't invest what the rich guy had entrusted to him. First one is he didn't think that his master was returning. He says, do business until I come. And if I can guarantee you that if the servant had thought that the master was coming back on January 27th of whatever year, he would have done everything he could to make sure everything was in order for when the master came back. But he didn't think he was coming back. And so he didn't do business. He didn't occupy. He didn't invest. And secondly, he says, I knew you're an austere man, and you take away what you haven't planted, and you rip off where you haven't sown, and I knew that's the way you were. It says in verse 21, I feared you. I was afraid of you. I feared God. I feared you. I think sometimes we're afraid of what he might ask us to do. That's why we don't occupy. We're afraid of what he might ask us to do. If I were to surrender, if I were to do what Zacchaeus did, I don't have to worry about him telling me to liquidate because I don't have anything to liquidate, but I would sure hate to go to some faraway place and eat bugs, and we're just so afraid that God is going to tell us to do that we don't occupy. We don't do business. We don't surrender to him fully. We're afraid of what he might ask of us. That he might, I think the reason why people don't do what Zacchaeus did and come to the Lord and just say, Lord, it's all yours now. Because we're afraid that he, and Jesus said, I'm going to go to your house and be your guest. I'm going to go and unload my burden so that I can unload your burden. And we're afraid that he might stop us from doing things that destroy us. And we're afraid that he might tell us to do things when something we don't want to do, when the things that we want to do that he doesn't want us to do are bad for us. And we're afraid he might make me stop doing something that's bad for me. And so we don't come to him. We don't abide. He might even ask me to do something like start tithing or to get involved in the church or something. And so we just say, nope, we're not going to get any of that on us. And it said that the guy feared him. Yet throughout if we understand the relationship of us standing before the judgment seat of Christ in this parable, the Bible is full of examples of where we are told to fear God. And yet in this example, this guy feared God, and yet it was to his detriment. It was to his destruction. There is a healthy fear and an unhealthy fear, right? I mean, verse 21 is an unhealthy fear. And it's not to, an unhealthy fear is when I'm afraid of what Jesus might ask of me. That's an unhealthy fear. I'm afraid is that he might turn me into some sort of Bible thumping fundamentalist, and I might just like raise my hand at an altar call or say the sinner's prayer or something like that, but that's about as far as it's going to go. I'm not going to be a fanatic about it because I'm afraid of what he might do in my life. And so he says in verse 27, but bring here those enemies of mine who did not want me to reign over them and slay them before me. Check this out. These enemies of mine, the rich guy said, the guy that's in the place of God, if we don't press it too far. He says, bring before me those enemies of mine and then slay them in front of me. Now, these guys weren't full on, they were not like they were planning some sort of rebellion. They weren't doing some sort of uprising. They weren't saying, we don't want anything, we're going to take this kingdom away from you. They weren't doing that, and he calls them his enemies. They just simply did not want the guy to rule over them. And so the guy calls them his enemies. They just merely wanted to live independently of the guy. And so there's that. And then check this out. But they were his subjects, whether they wanted to be or not. They were part of his domain, his kingdom, if you will, whether that's something that they wanted to have or not. They were still his subjects. They still had to answer. There was an accountability to him. I think that as we look at this story, we kind of wrap it up, we can kind of see it as a number of these people who didn't want the guy to rule over him. And, were these guys really, I mean, they were subject of the kingdom, so were they saved or were they not saved? Were they going to go to heaven? Were they just going to go there without rewards when they get there? I would think that in this group that's represented here, it's a broad spectrum of people, and there's a lot of different kinds of people who don't want God to rule over them. And I believe that it would include saved people. That when they die, they're going to go to heaven, but they just don't want God to rule over them. They make excuses. They find out, they call Jesus their Lord, but they make excuses for the things that they do. They justify and rationalize the things that they do, so that they don't have to surrender everything to Him. You know, some is, when I was 8 years old, I raised my hand in Sunday school and I accepted the Lord, but ever since then I've had some sort of lackadaisical kind of walk, and here I am in my mid whatever decade, and there's been no measurable change in me, but I accepted the Lord. I got the Lord's grace when I was 8 years old. Another example would be me in my testimony. I usually say that I got saved on November 7th, 1981. This would have been right after I turned 30 years old when I accepted the Lord. However, back in the 60s when I was in high school, I had this thing where I was going to this church, and I realized the lack of my own life, and I remember praying a sinner's prayer and surrendering my life to the Lord, even though my girlfriend and I were still fornicating and doing all kinds of, we were drinking and everything, but we were going to church. And it wasn't that I was just being a poser. It wasn't like I was acting like I was somebody on Sundays and then forgetting about it when I walked out of the church. Because I remember as a senior in high school carrying my Bible around with me in school. And I didn't care if people saw it, and if they asked me about it, I would explain to them. I would. But then right after I graduated, I started doing drugs, and it was just kind of like a big downhill thing all the way through the 70s. And if you'd asked me at any time during the 70s if I were to die that day, would I go to heaven or not, I would have said no, probably not, because I didn't think I was a Christian. And so that's why I usually say November 7, 1981 is my spiritual birthday. But there were changes in my life back when I was in high school. Changes that never did really escape me. I never did use the Lord's name in vain again after that. I can remember one time being with some friends, and they were all talking about being agnostic, and I wanted to say I was too, but I just couldn't. I could not say those words. Did I get saved on November 7th, 1981, or did I get saved as a senior in high school? Who cares? I'm 68 now. I've been walking with the Lord for, without exception, for almost 4 decades. Who cares? It makes no difference now, does it? I mean, maybe when I get to heaven, I'll find out that I got saved as a teenager. Maybe I'll find out that I wasn't. That it just didn't. It never did. The point is, the only thing that matters is where am I with Jesus? Why do I have to kind of parse it out in my past? There is we will have an accounting. We will stand before the judge. Some of us will stand before him at the Bema, and we will decide he will decide whether we get rewards or lack of them. Some of us will stand before a judgment that's called the Great White Throne. And there are no saved people of that one. With people that go before the Great White Throne, they are all lost, and they will only answer. There'll be one question Jesus asks him, "What did you do with the salvation that I offered you?" And everybody at that judgment will say, "I just didn't want you to rule over me." And everybody in that judgment will be lost. And they will have rejected heaven. They would have rejected grace. They would have rejected God's love for them. I love it. One of my favorite Spurgeon quotes. And I got a bunch of them, but I love Spurgeon. He's so quotable. He says, "When you preach on heaven, have a face that reflects the sweetness of God." When we talk about what it's going to be like to be with Jesus for all eternity, our faces should glow. And he said to his students, he says, when you're preaching on heaven, have a face that just reflects the idea that that someday you're going to be in God's presence for all eternity. He says, but when you preach on hell, your normal face will do quite well. Isn't that a good one? You know, the important thing is, here's the takeaway. I mean, the important thing is, God loves us. He loves us right where we are, and He's got something for us. He's got a plan for us. He's got a life for us. He's got eternity for us. And we can either embrace it, or we can say, I don't want that guy to rule over me. But why would we reject what we're made for? The rich young ruler did. Zacchaeus didn't. Why would we want to reject perfect love? Why would we want to reject understanding why we were placed in this universe? Let's pray. God, we thank you, we praise you, you give us so much love, so much grace. Lord, you're so patient with us. I can remember all the times where I said, no, I don't want you to rule over me. No, I don't want to give up my gods. No, I don't want what you had to offer me. And I knew that I was rejecting your grace and rejecting your love. And you were so patient with me. And I thank you for that. And you're still that same long-suffering, patient Creator God. You still want to work in our hearts. You still want to shower us with your love. You want us to come and receive your Son Jesus with no strings, no just a full surrender of our life to you. And you have promised that when we do that, when we give that surrender, that you will give your life to us. So I pray you do that in our midst even today, as you have been doing for so many thousands of years. Show your grace. In Jesus' name, amen.